About a year ago, I did a video I didn't think I wanted to do. I made a video not about Steins Gate Zero, the anime, but about Steins Gate Zero, the visual novel. I wanted to cover it in advance of the series because as a game, it was quite a bit different in a lot of ways from the original Steins Gate, and not just with its narrative. Its tone became far darker. The lighthearted antics and references of the original still existed, but were fewer and further between.
Ultimately, I left the novel with a full recommendation, but mostly only for fans of the series. As a quasi-sequel to the first novel, it wasn't really newcomer-friendly, and most people who would be interested this many years since the original came out would probably just be people like me who qualify for die-hard fan status. I did briefly touch on the, at the time, upcoming anime series and some of my concerns, because unlike the original series, the visual novel for Zero was far less linear, making the changeover from visual novel to anime that much more difficult, as you couldn't just straight up storyboard the show from the game, as they could have before. Adapting Zero would require a little more finesse, melding plot lines and hard narrative paths into a semblance of a linear narrative while still making sense to the audience. They needed to keep the integrity of Zero's visual novel while still keeping many of the things that made the experience playing it great, even if less interactive. This is not an easy feat when a very large portion of the visual novel story could easily become cut content that doesn't flow with the rest of it. But now that the anime is out, completed, how did it go? Well, short version is that it is a fantastic continuation to the original plot for people who either can't or choose not to play the visual novels. But as an adaptation of said novels, it leaves a lot of things out. For the longer version, well, that's what this video is for. So ladies, gentlemen, and others, my name is Arcada, and today on Glass Reflection, we are going to be discussing the sequel to the 2011 anime that has remained one of my favorite anime of all time, Steins Gate Zero. Let's jam.
Zero starts off a little bit differently than the traditional sequel, mostly because it isn't one. This does not take place after the events of the previous series, but during said events, something only rarely possible when time travel and world lines are involved. At the end of Steins Gate, Okabe, with the help of future soldier Suzuha, uses a time machine to travel back several weeks into the events of the story's first few hours, all in an attempt to save the life of the character Makase Kurisu. After his first attempt failed horribly, he and Suzuha return to the roof of the radio building that they set off from in the first place to take a quick reprieve, during which time Okabe, disheartened, gets a pep talk from his childhood friend Mayuri, as well as a video file from his future self, congratulating him on his failed attempt and giving him the solution to the problem of how to save Kurisu. Okabe then proceeds to make a second attempt, and the story continues to its true ending. Steins Gate Zero, however, is the story of that future Okabe, the one from The Message, the one who fails to save Makase Kurisu and then spends the rest of his life trying to find the route to Steins Gate. Or rather, this is the story of an Okabe who has given up. And it is the tale of what convinces him to take up the lab coat once again in search of Steins Gate. In this timeline, Makase Kurisu is dead, has been for months now. Okabe has given up the mantle of mad scientist and has instead begun to focus on his studies. This is an Okabe that suffers from anxiety, depression, undiagnosed PTSD, probably. An Okabe who is constantly confronted by the past he has left behind, but chooses to ignore it and pray it disappears. Until, of course, he is placed in a room in order to interact with a new artificial intelligence developed in America called Amadeus, an AI that looks like and has the same personality of his dead friend, Kurisu. Suddenly, the problems with this all fall into place. Much of the conflict from the original Steins Gate came from a race to control the world's first time machine. And in that case, not a literal time machine, but a machine capable of messaging the past. It did, however, lead to the development of the Time Leap machine by none other than Kirisu herself. Her mind is what was capable of developing that machine, and despite her death 1 year prior, her mind still exists inside Amadeus. It's the fight over this technology that drives a lot of the solid narrative within the show. The only rocky bits are the new additions. The story now has to continue the narrative outside the previously used time loop, with the challenge of reintroducing all the characters from before, along with some new ones. The enjoyment as well has to come from somewhere else than it did previously, where before the time travel story leading to a pinnacle ending where our characters reached their desired outcome was thrilling. But here, we know the ending. We've seen it. We know that the final tale of this Okabe just has him sending a message to his past self, and the series has to make the journey to that moment as gripping while not going too far outside what you would expect from a Steins Gate story. How well the series succeeded in this is largely up to your own interpretation, and here's my take. In a very broad sense, the anime succeeded where it needed to. The Zero adaptation is as close to being faithful to the source material as best we could have expected, and on its own, the story is a worthy successor to the original, as it is, if nothing else, a fantastic revisit to the characters and the world we had come to enjoy. That said, the adaptation is not without its missteps. Missteps that, while I can't necessarily blame the series for entirely, it doesn't make me any less disappointed. Some of the common complaints I've seen laid on the narrative, and this includes the visual novel as well, not just the anime specifically, usually come down to one of three things: Amadeus, Maho, and Kagari, only one of which I actually agree with. Amadeus was the easy way to reintroduce Kirisu as a dead character back into the narrative. While it leans a bit on the contrived side, as she conveniently had her brain scanned and copied prior to the events in the original Steins Gate, which was then utilized to create an AI construct, not having Kirisu as a character at all would have been a massive blow to the chemistry of the characters. Plus, having this AI be a constant reminder to Okabe of his dark choices only added to his own personal development, which I really liked. Maho is very similar, being introduced alongside Amadeus, seemingly to fit into a Kirisu-shaped whole. As such, she might have been written off by some people as a replacement that they did not want. But her charm and wit to me became indispensable, even if I wish that her introduction actually happened in the original narrative so that her appearance here makes a bit more sense. Really though, that is the boiled down version of all of my disappointments with Zero's narrative. The additions feel tacked on because we are trying to follow up a story that existed entirely within a closed loop. Characters like Yuki emphasize this, as she is Suzuha's mother, who was mentioned as someone that existed in the original but never was fully introduced until now. Oh, you thought that girl from the OVA was Suzuha's mom? Yeah, well, retcon's a bitch. The worst offender, though, here in the adaptation was Kagari. Kagari is a young girl from the future who physically looks near identical to Kirisu, except in some obvious ways. She's introduced into the plot as being brought along from the future by Suzuha, before accidentally getting dropped off in the 1990s due to some events I won't get into. But isn't it convenient that Suzuha brought her from the future, but then didn't mention her or call attention to her existence until quite a ways into Zero's story? Her character actually makes a lot more sense in the world of Zero's visual novel. She has several arcs dedicated to her story, arcs which didn't fully get translated properly, leaving her quite underdeveloped here in the anime. I understand that they couldn't just cut her from the narrative to make things smooth out a bit more, nor could they add enough time to fix the problems with her story, but her existence in the narrative that the anime presents doesn't make all that much sense, leaving the narrative hand-waving of her introduction that much harder to ignore. Kagari isn't the only thing missing from the original plot to Zero, however. There are plenty of major plot reveals over the course of Zero's visual novel that don't make an appearance here in the anime. While that on its own, I'm fine with, given how the adaptation went, I had more of a problem with the little nods to the lost content that the anime did here. For example, there is the return of a skin-tight female character in a motorcycle helmet, made famous in the first story. Back then, underneath that helmet was the aloof Moeka, who was an assassin for CERN. But in Steins Gate Zero, 4 separate female characters interact with the cast in that outfit. But here in the anime, it's only 3. Or rather, only 3 revealed characters. The 4th does interact with our cast during the story, but the helmet never comes off like it did in the visual novel, and there is only a little tiny wink of who it could be presented to the audience before the plotline is swiftly forgotten about. Where Steins Gate was a near-perfect adaptation of its source with few things left out that weren't really necessary to the overall plot and more of a fun surprise to anybody that would go back and play the novel after the fact, Zero leaves far more behind unexplained. Far more than can just be waved away by saying, well, it makes sense if you go play the visual novel, and I can't say I like that particular part about it. I would have much preferred if you either adapt it fully or cut out what you can't explain. Hopefully with some of these complaints you understand now why I generally avoid reading or, in this case, playing the original material first. It does nothing but make my mind do constant comparisons and ultimately think less of the animated version because of it. I don't like that. I don't want to seem, however, like I'm being hard on the series because it's bad. It has its problems, yes, but I'm mostly being harsh on it because of how passionate I am about this story. Zero is a much darker tale than the original, which is odd to say considering some of the more gruesome subject matter from the original story. Where previously we would have just had death either shown or alluded to us at various intervals, we now have an entirely new narrative starring a guy who's suffering from some serious depression and anxiety issues, who now has his demons coming back to haunt him, which is surprisingly relatable, as bad as that sounds. The shadow overlords of the original Steins Gate haven't gone anywhere, and the threat of a Terminator-like future still lingers, as is constantly emphasized by Suzuha, the future girl now stuck here because she doesn't have enough fuel to go home, and can't do her job because Okabe is far too withdrawn into his shell. It is a brilliant addition to the already existing story, but it's not something that can stand alone. As such, I can't recommend this series to everyone. Zero is a narrative that I think only people who extremely enjoyed the original would bother to even get through. It's a show that's really meant to be enjoyed for the journey that the characters take, and less for the result at the end of it. Mostly because the end is already known to us. This is more of an expanded epilogue to show you another part of how we got there. And if you didn't like Steins Gate 1, there's nothing here to change your mind. But if you do like Steins Gate as much as I do, then this is something that you should definitely watch, and then later add to your shelf. I'll recommend it to any fan of the series as a worthy sequel. Because ultimately, Zero does something that I thought impossible. It creates a sequel to a closed-loop time travel story that not only builds on the original, but also justifies its own existence in one fell swoop. Plus, no other story will have you grinning like a madman at the prospect of a guy putting on a lab coat quite like Zero.
Thank you, good person, for spending the time to watch this video on Steins Gate Zero. I hope you enjoyed it. There will be links down in the thingy down there so that you can go and watch the series and the locations for which it is available. Funimation for dub and Crunchyroll for sub. For alternate recommendations, I would like to start you off with the time travel-esque anime that I don't want to see forgotten into the rivers of time. That being Erased. It is a particularly gripping drama that easily scratched my Steins Gate itch while I waited to get my hands on Zero, so I can only assume that it could work in reverse for you. Second recommendation for those of you who like seeing your main character wallow in a pit of despair, welcome to the NHK. It is a series I have not talked about in a while on this channel. That is not because I do not believe it is worth watching. It is. If you want to see another kind of broken protagonist try to solve the mess of their lives, there is no series, I think, better suited for that task. Between those, I hope you can find something to your liking. And lastly, at the end of this week, I want to give special thank you to you, my patrons, who not only love and support me, but allow me to continue to do what I do. You guys are amazing. Why are you so amazing? This doesn't make any sense, actually. It really doesn't. It shouldn't happen. It shouldn't happen. Though, specifically, as I am wont to do, I want to give particular shout-out to patrons City Yamako, Victor Ekmark, Ryfen Bonaparte, Rune Jacobson, Devin North, Joshua Garcia, and Calhoun Boy for being especially awesome. You guys are great. And until next time, ladies, gentlemen, and others, watch more anime and stay frosty.